Hello and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones, and I should say up front that this episode is really one of two, goes with another talk. They should go together, and the source of that first talk is a sermon that I gave live this past week, and I'm recording the second one now. So both will have a different feel if you should go back and watch the live talk that I gave that leads up to this one. But they're both written along similar lines, so maybe this will be a good thing. Who knows? You can maybe have two different kinds of experiences or just this one. But if you want to catch the first talk, you can do so by visiting our church's website, which is www.ndncc.org. And there you can find that libraries of more recent services, Bible lessons, and whatnot. I didn't record the podcast for that first because, honestly, I don't have the time this week. But you can find that talk there in a live format. But today we're recording the second, which may well stand alone well enough if I do my job right. More on that in a second. First, I'd like to thank and acknowledge the All Indiana Podcast Network. The All Indiana Podcast Network produces and distributes the Northwood Podcast across all platforms, at least the ones that I know about, and we are beyond grateful for this. And I think that you should check out their other offerings. You can do so by visiting wishtv.com/podcasts. That's wishtv.com/podcasts. And if you'd like to learn more about me or my church, you may either write to me directly by email at Heath, that's my name, Heath, at ndncc.org. Or if you'd like to peruse the church from afar, you could check out our website. That's www.indyncc.org, as I mentioned before. And as I said, also, you'll be able to find service times, various ministries of the church, links to this podcast, videos, as well as write-ups of our values. So please check it out. Lastly, if you haven't yet, like, subscribe, or follow us by way of whatever platform you are now using or otherwise prefer. This way, you'll receive notifications about all of our new episodes, as well as it'll help spread the word about the Northwood Podcast or our ministries generally. So we would appreciate it if you would take the time to pause and like, subscribe, follow, whatever, in this moment or when you're done. And moving on, here in a moment, we'll be considering a reading from the Gospel of Mark. But first, we need to pause for some ads for our podcast audience. If this means you, I'll catch you soon.
Temp check. What kind of summer are we having this year? A family road trip summer? A beach bum summer? Or a wake me up when the sun sets summer? With Instacart, choose your own adventure and skip the shopping side quests. Where available, you can get ice cream delivered to your hotel, sunscreen to the pool, or cold brew to your bed. Well, door, in as fast as 30 minutes. Wherever you find yourself this summer, you can get the goods. Download Instacart for free delivery on your first 3 orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Minimum $10 per order. Excludes restaurants. Additional terms and fees apply.
Okay, it's time to commit. 2024 is the year for prioritizing yourself. Begin your new smile journey with Byte, and you could start seeing results in just 2 to 3 weeks. Just order your at-home impression kit today for only $14.95 at Byte.com. Byte clear aligners are doctor-directed and delivered to your door. Treatment costs thousands less than braces. Plus, they offer financing options, accept eligible insurance, and you can pay with your HSA FSA. Get 80% off your impression kit when you use code WONDERY at Byte.com. That's BYTE.com. Start your confidence journey today with Byte.
And we're back. As I was saying, today we'll be going over a passage from the Gospel of Mark, more specifically Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 34, part of what we read last week, in fact. And then we'll jump on ahead quite a ways, in fact, to verses 53 through 56. And that's where we'll conclude. So that's Mark 6, 30 through 34, and then 53 through 56, and I'll read it now. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place, all by yourselves, and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Now jumping up to verse 53. When they had crossed over the Sea of Galilee, they came to the land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed out about the whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch him, even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Last week, if you were with us, which you'd had to have been watching online, live, or in person at our church, but if you were, then you'll recall, probably most of you won't recall, how we compared two banquets to highlight conflicting values. On one hand, you had Herod Antipas's feast, which was the governing ruler on behalf of Rome in Jesus' area as he was a young man. And at Herod's feast, he was served by, he was waited on by the least, the last. He was entertained by his own daughter, and at the end, the prophet John the Baptist's head was removed from the rest of him. You can read about it for yourself if you just go back before what we just read in the same chapter, Mark chapter 6, but verses 14 through 29. I'll not read it now or belabor the point except to say that John lost his head because he spoke truth to power, and power cut his voice down. Or did it? Because when news of Jesus' ministry came to Herod's ears, he wondered if the very John the Baptist he had beheaded had actually come back to life. And here I'll just read his initial reaction to Jesus' ministry. This is after King Herod had the prophet John the Baptist beheaded. And the text reads, King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said it is Elijah, and others said it is a prophet like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. It's from back in Mark chapter 6, verses 14 through 16. But rest assured that John the Baptist had lost his head. The question is, and what Herod is then grappling with, had he lost his voice? It's that way whenever a prophet is cut down, the voice carries on. Often carries on. Maybe most usually carries on if they're a real prophet. Past their very deaths. Herod and the other powerful individuals will learn this again and again in the coming years as they try to put a stop to Jesus' ministry and the movement that would follow. They would learn you can't cut down, really, the prophetic voice, the voice that will find some way to speak on behalf of God, or God speaking through the prophet for the people. And then John was killed. Well, at a banquet or party set by a despotic king with certain values, and that feast reflected the values of the great Roman Empire. But what immediately follows, and what we talked about last week, is that story where Jesus divides 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed thousands. It's a story often handled alone. But this other meal provides, or banquet if you will, it provides a reflection on the very different values that were revealed at Herod's feast just down the road. I'll turn to the writing of Dr. Ron Allen, biblical scholar, to make the overall point of comparing these two meals. And here it goes. And I quote, the guests at Herod's banquet were his courtiers and officers and the leaders of Galilee. Those fed by Jesus in the desert were the many who had no leisure even to eat. Herod's guests, in Hellenistic fashion, reclined on couches to eat and would have been served by women and other nobodies, quote unquote. The powerless serving the powerful, the poor serving the rich. In stark contrast, Jesus' banquet takes place on the grass, and everyday people are the guests. The disciples serve them, doing the work of women and other nobodies, demonstrating the point that, and here Dr. Allen quotes the Gospel of Mark from later, chapter 10, picking back up, demonstrating the point that, quote, among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, but it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must become your servant. And here, Dr. Allen leaves off that quote and picks back up and concludes what I will read with the following. Jesus' ministry was not just talk. It was words acted out in deeds. Deeds interpreted by words. So last week was all about that. In case you missed it, our talk was called Two Meals because we compared these two meals that I'm referencing here, but we didn't read about directly. One set by Herod, the other by Jesus, and we reflected on the sort of world each represents. One, Herod's, is a hierarchical world where the poor are exploited and the powerless ignored. Sound familiar? The other, Jesus's, reflects the realm of God, where the last will be first and the poor elevated. We concluded last week by noticing how our own church community at Northwood in many ways reflects the values of Jesus' meal. I'm proud of this as the pastor of this church, that we are, by and large, an egalitarian community comprised of haves and have-nots both, materially well off and some of us not so much, and it doesn't matter much at church. This is reflected not only in our composition on most Sundays, should you come by to visit, but in our leadership structure. I'm proud of our church, but we also must live into the vision of Jesus still more. We can all agree that there is still much work to be done at Northwood collectively and in our individual hearts. But also, we noted last week that perhaps most of the work needs doing outside of our church's walls. And this is where, if we finally caught up to where today's lectionary text takes us. You may have noticed how we read what built up to Jesus' feeding of the 5,000, but then the text skips over that miracle, which we read last week, although we weren't supposed to, as well as his walking on water story. Those are two classics. And then it asks us to pick back up the reading just where Mark seems to be finishing up, putting a bow on the final details. I'll just read for you those final verses, 53 through 56, again right here. And they go, when they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. And then the story moves on. More on what comes next in following weeks and months. But I know maybe what you were thinking or what I was thinking, or I often think after reading a passage like that, my eyes glaze over because those words are so much like so much of what else I read in other Gospels. So you may be thinking, yeah, that's Jesus just doing Jesus stuff. I mean, we've heard all this before and we expect it to heal and to minister to those who aren't well off. But now, reading this through, with the lens that we've just been handed just before when we compared Herod's feast to Jesus's, well, we're supposed to leave with a new understanding and awareness as we leave our communion tables, where we have feasted with our brothers and sisters in Christ, and then continue to hold on to those values outside. We bring the good news everywhere. So we notice how this text begins by giving us insight as to how Jesus saw the masses of people who followed him in the first place. It reads, as he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. That's Mark 6, verse 34. When the Herods of the world step outside, they don't see sheep without a shepherd. They see people who, if they cannot serve an economic system well, or their own ends or objectives well, then they'd rather not see them, the sheep or the poor. And we've still got this problem today. I mean, how do we see the less fortunate, or whatever polite words we find for the struggling, suffering in our streets? Do we see them as sheep without a shepherd? And trust me, that means a people under bad and ineffective leadership. Or do we experience them as people we'd rather not see at all? We could sweep under the rug if we could sweep a person under a rug. Jesus saw the people as the very ones he came to serve. The point. Herod saw them as those who may serve him, he being the point, or if not him, some other economic interests. Or if not, well, how can we, he, anyone, remove them from sight? That was the question, those questions for Herod then, and for many now. If the poor cannot be siphoned off into some position that can grind their labor into wealth, then how can we remove them from our sight? Today, we might call it cleaning up the streets. There have been renewed efforts of late to legislate in our cities against the poor and those without a place to call home. We've not the cultural willpower, I don't think, or the concentration right now to fix the social systems that drive poverty. So we'd rather sweep under the rug and the refuse, wipe it away in the form of people under some metaphorical rug, or under the form of a literal bridge or tarp, underpass, or on a bench that they've been relegated to and have been asked to call, I will not say a home, bridge, a bench, a park, not a home. Bridge may be for trolls, not for people. Or tolls. Yet, in many ways, we've blinded ourselves so that we cannot see the sheep without shepherds that we've been called to serve in this year 2024. Now here I've a rather lengthy quote from a paper called The Criminalization of Homelessness. It's written by Eric S. Tars, the legal director of the National Homelessness Law Center. And he writes, every day in America, people experiencing homelessness are threatened by law enforcement, ticketed, and even arrested for living in public spaces when they have no other alternative. Millions of individuals, families, and youth experience homelessness each year, and millions more lack access to decent, stable housing they can afford. Rather than providing adequate housing options, too many communities criminalize homelessness by making it illegal for people to sit, sleep, or even eat in public places, despite the absence of adequate alternatives. These laws and policies violate constitutional, civil, and human rights, traumatize homeless individuals, and negatively impact their physical and mental health, and create arrest records, fines, and fees that stand in the way of homeless people securing jobs or housing. Yet providing affordable housing and services has been repeatedly proven to cost less than criminalizing homelessness and be more effective at getting and keeping people off the streets. It's a long quote written by a scholar, so forgive me if you nodded off, but I included that last line too, about how it costs less to provide for poor people than what we do now, as if that were the point. But for some people, this seems to matter. So even for those, if that matters, the cost, it would still save you money, but it shouldn't. We'd often rather save money in the short term than serve humanity at large and in the big picture. So these are the choices we make. We criminalize poverty as if to be poor were some kind of moral failing. And in so doing, we drive entire families into generational poverty. Hundreds of years, at least decades, longer. It goes on and it goes because we don't see those put upon in our world as sheep in need of a good shepherd. We see them as problems to hide. It's time to call what is hidden to the surface because it's bubbling up these days anyway. We found in recent years that we cannot simply hide the poverty that impacts our communities in the United States. It's catching up to us. What is needed is for those like us who have sat around generous communion tables in our churches or in our homes for years, each set in the spirit of the great banquet Jesus sets again and again for those in need. Well, it's for us, we who have experienced what it is like to discover ourselves to be sheep found by our shepherd, to bring this meal this perspective to every other place. So we need to take this perspective, this lens outside, which means here that we Christians, followers of Jesus, need to challenge the assumptions and suggestions of those who would bury the poor rather than care for them. We need to challenge those who would spend our collective resources on stadiums built for entertainment when we could be setting up entire communities for positive futures by ensuring basic needs met as a baseline for human existence. But no, we do not. And for this reason, Jesus said the poor will always be with us. Our fault, not because something cannot be done. Something can be done. But we don't, as a culture and altogether, look out on those in need with enough compassion to change our moral landscape. How do we do this? Well, look around you. How many of God's children do you see who need the help we Christians are called to give? And we give it. You'll notice one important detail in these stories. Jesus is always calling his disciples into the work he is doing. He takes the bread, then the disciples distribute it. Jesus teaches and heals, and then he sends his disciples to do the same. Now it is us. We hold bread in our hands in church, literally in the sacrament, metaphorically through our resources that we give, our money that we give in offering. We break it and we eat it together in this ritual we call communion, Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, church broadly, from offering to songs to prayer, all of it. And the Lord here being Jesus who sets this table, and we in church pantomime the generosity of God for ourselves and others. But here's what we must not miss. This meal is for everyone. This meal is for all of those who others shove aside. This meal is for rich and poor alike. And we are each the servants of all, called to be anyway. So I don't send you out today with a program or a better social safety net, although I do think we need those. We'll get that right when our hearts are no longer enslaved to greed. We'll see the sheep in need of shepherding for who they truly are, children of God, as soon as the blinders that our consumer culture has placed on our eyes fall off. But for now, I'm afraid. As the Apostle Paul once said, we see as but through a glass darkly. But we don't have to be afraid, for that lens will fall. Jesus can give us new eyes to see with. In fact, you've been given them now. The question is, will you use them and respond as you should? This has been the Northwood Podcast. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe to the podcast by way of whatever app you use to listen, or leave a comment. These points of engagement drive more traffic our way. Or check out our website, www.indyncc.org. And also check out the other podcasts produced by the All Indiana Podcast Network. Until next time, this has been the Northwood Podcast. I am Heath Jones. Peace.